Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You heard from earlier speakers of the worldwide crisis from deficiencies in nutrition and how they'll affect the brain. Most of you here today will be aware of the growing incidence of obesity and diabetes and other adverse conditions. I want to focus on a less well-known link between obesity, diabetes and the brain, a condition now being regarded as type 3 diabetes, and how this is going to affect memory. And to some extent I'm going to identify some of the mechanisms behind the effects that Dominic talked about. Where do I point this? Oh, there we are. This shows very briefly the relationship between diet, which of the present day, and what's sometimes called the paleo diet. Now, the Western diet, we've been eating this for about 200 years. The so-called paleo diet, probably for 200,000 years, during which time there's been time for evolutionary changes and epigenetic changes. And you can see the differences here, high levels of consumption of sugars, fruit juices and sugar products. Paleo diet, probably low. Fats about the same. Saturated grain-fed meat, high today, low there. Omega-3, probably high in present time. Oily fish, less. And the converse in the paleo diet. This is a shot of the levels, the prevalence of obesity worldwide. I don't expect you to read everything, but what I've done is pulled out some of the statistics. Surprisingly, it's showing that the highest level of obesity is in the Middle East. Kuwait, Kuwait, these are for men, but even more surprisingly is the prevalence of obesity in the Middle East, particularly for women, where approximately half of the women in Qatar are obese. And you can see England is fairly low down the bottom, USA in the middle, but both sexes are dominated by countries in the Middle East. So this is extremely disturbing. Now, you probably all know about type 1 diabetes, or sometimes called infantile diabetes. Type 2, or used to be called maturity onset diabetes, because it wasn't found until, sorry, I should speak at the microphone, shouldn't I? It usually only showed up people in the 30s, but now we're seeing children with type 2 diabetes, which is largely environmental, particularly changes in the diet. Oops, the wrong one. Now, GDM, sometimes, which is gestational diabetes, occurs in the mother during pregnancy. It affects both the mother and the fetus, and it usually resolves at birth. But both mother and the fetus show elevated blood sugar, insulin resistance, increased fat deposits, increased fat deposits in the infant, obesity, cardiovascular disease, eye and kidney damage. These are shown up both in the mother and in the fetus. Now, I'm going to talk about type 3 diabetes, sometimes known as brain diabetes. This is still controversial, and it's only relatively recently that researchers have identified similar changes in the brain to those that are occurring in the body in patients with diabetes. This is characterized in the brain by insulin resistance, brain fog, brain shrinking, challenging childhood behaviors, aggression in the young adults, dementia, and Alzheimer's disease. and this is a conclusion from an American investigator fairly recently, we conclude that Alzheimer's disease is a form of diabetes that selectively involves the brain. How many of you are aware of that? Not very many. But obviously it's important. Now again, I showed you a shot earlier of the prevalence of obesity. Now this shows the prevalence of diabetes. And again, sorry, you can see here that Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Middle East countries all have the highest incidence of diabetes. What is most concerning is that about half of this level of diabetes in all these states is still undiagnosed. And what this is going to mean for future generations, we really don't know. Now, I think Dominic mentioned the effects on the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that's involved in forming, storing memories and influence emotions. Now, I think he's been mentioned some of these already. Higher intakes of unhealthy foods are associated with a reduced hippocampal volume. Western diet associated with small hippocampus measurements. So these are all research papers attesting to the effects of diabetes on the brain. Now again, just as a brief summary of the effects of gestational diabetes that I mentioned earlier. This can affect the development of the brain of the fetus, can lead to fetal hypoxia, oxygen starvation, and threaten at birth. It increases macrosomia, large fat babies, that can induce birth asphyxia in the infant. Fat babies give fat children, fat adults develop metabolic syndrome, which is a sort of pre-diabetic state. This also, the diabetes in the mother can affect the fetal pancreas, leading to neonatal hypoglycemia. Well, I'm sorry about this, pressing the wrong button. There we go. And one of the effects is to induce fetal and postnatal iron deficiency, which we know affects brain development. And school children from mothers with gestational diabetes have been shown to show inattention at school and an effect on motor skills. Again, Simon showed some of these figures, and you can see the prevalence of diabetes in currently 2009, 6.9% in Europe, and you can see again, these are pretty much the same. But what is disturbing is actually the numbers of dementia patients, and you can see here an increasing number up to 2050. And that's from 2015, 34% increase in the number of patients with dementia. But what is disturbing is the figure in the Middle East, which relates to the figures I showed you earlier of diabetes and obesity. And you can see a massive increase in the number of individuals affected by diabetes by 2020. And the costs for this are enormous. I haven't made any attempt to calculate these. I know Simon has done something. This just briefly summarizes the mechanisms at play. Obesity produces metabolic syndrome, which is characterized by hypertension, hyperlipidemia, and hyperglycemia. Insulin resistance, which then produces type 2 diabetes and also gestational diabetes, and this then goes on to produce type 3 diabetes, which leads to aggression, motor impairment, dementia, Alzheimer's, death. Now, obviously we haven't time to show this, but there's quite a lot of evidence that increasing the levels of omega-3 can reduce the effects at these two levels, and over here as well. I couldn't make the arrows go over there. So basically what it's saying is that obesity is going to lead to major increases in dementia and Alzheimer's, obviously, and eventually death. What can we do about it? These are fairly obvious. Education, so say, what's it said? Education, education, education. Using the media, encourage exercise programs, particularly for women and girls. Educate men on the risks, because after all, they have offspring who are going to be affected if they don't follow a healthy diet. Again, this is very at the site at the present moment, taxing of high sugar drinks, and encouraging consumption of fish oil, fish such as salmon. Now, we might say how the people in the Middle East are ones of the most badly affected by obesity and diabetes is to grow salmon. This may seem a little strange, but it hasn't always been the case. Some of you may have seen that film. So, thank you. Thank you.